Hey guys, tonight we're going to dive into the sleepy world of Greek mythology. And don't worry, you'll probably survive this, unlike most of the poor souls in these stories. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video, and subscribe it only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, comment your location and time. Let's see where all my sleepyheads are tuning in from tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine this: you're strolling through the warm golden haze of Mount Olympus, the home of the gods, and something feels ... off. It's quieter than usual. You wander deeper, following the gentle breeze that rustles the leaves, and before you know it, you're in the palace of Hypnos, the god of sleep. Hypnos isn't the most glamorous deity in Greek mythology, but if there's one thing he's really good at, it's making sure the gods get their rest. Forget your usual bustling gods like Zeus or Apollo. Hypnos isn't about drama, he's about rest. No thunderbolts here, just soft dreams. Picture him lounging around, surrounded by the most comfortable pillows and blankets. Because for Hypnos, sleep isn't just a necessity, it's an art form now. Let's be real, sleeping, for the gods, isn't as easy as closing your eyes. Oh no, Hypnos has an entire family dedicated to helping the gods and mortals alike drift into the deepest slumbers. His children are even more interesting, called the Oneroi. They are the personifications of dreams. Imagine them as the weird, quirky artists of the dream world, each creating strange, symbolic dreams for anyone who dares to sleep. You might find yourself dreaming of flying over vast seas one night, and the next, you might be chasing after an elusive figure in a labyrinth. It's all in a day's work for the Oneroi. The most famous of these dreamweavers is Orpheus. Picture him as the dream courier, the guy who's responsible for delivering the most vivid dreams, often in the form of messages. He was basically the ancient Greek equivalent of your phone's notification system, a bit more dramatic. He could even shapeshift to appear as anyone, delivering dreams through the night. Some say Orpheus was a bit too good at his job sometimes. People woke up so disoriented by the vividness of their dreams that they'd forget what reality even felt like. Sounds like an ultra-familiar Monday morning, right? But let's talk about Hypnos for a second. While the gods on Olympus might be busy plotting wars or causing chaos, Hypnos is often quietly tucked away in his dark cave, a place that smells of lavender and pine, with soft melodies drifting through the air. His home is more serene than anything you've ever seen. If you think your sleep is peaceful, imagine the sleep Hypnos gives. Everything is gentle, soothing, and most of all, uninterrupted. No monster attacks, no angry gods demanding attention, just pure, uninterrupted rest. In fact, even the strongest gods and goddesses have learned the value of a nap under Hypnos' care. Zeus, the king of the gods, was known to sneak away for naps on occasion, even in the midst of major battles. Maybe, just maybe, that's the secret to his power. A well-rested ruler can take on anything, right? Some scholars still argue whether Hypnos was truly all-powerful or simply a figure of quiet influence. There's a debate about whether the gods, who were supposed to be all-knowing and immortal, would even need sleep at all. If you think about it, sleep isn't just for resting your body, it's for rejuvenating the mind, and in the case of the gods, perhaps, their minds needed to rest from their eternal responsibilities. It's like how even the most energetic people eventually need to take a break from their phones or the internet to preserve their sanity. But the idea of sleep as a divine necessity isn't exactly what most people would think of when they imagine immortality. So, the question remains, are the gods truly immortal, or do they, too, need a reset from time to time, while Hypnos is master of sleep? Let's not forget the second part of the family, his twin brother Thanatos, the god of death. Yeah, kind of a downer, right? It's like being the backup singer to the main act, except your job is a little more final. Thanatos doesn't have as much fun as Hypnos, and his work isn't nearly as cozy. Death isn't something to snooze through, right? But here's the thing. The twins were often mistaken for one another. You see, when someone would die in their sleep, because death, in Greek mythology, can come gently and quietly, without much fuss that was attributed to Hypnos's influence. But when death came unexpectedly, like in battle or an accident, Thanatos was the one pulling the strings. It's kind of funny to think that Hypnos might have taken the blame for something he wasn't even involved in. A little misunderstanding of cosmic proportions, right? Still, there's a charm to Hypnos's world, isn't there? He represents something we all long for, rest. But rest is tricky, even in the realm of the gods. You know that feeling when you try to fall asleep, and the more you think about it, the harder it gets. That's essentially what Hypnos was always trying to avoid. His mission was to ease the gods into sleep without them thinking too hard about it. It's a little like trying to text Zeus. Imagine having to get his attention while he's juggling thunderbolts and storm clouds. Getting Hypnos's blessing for a peaceful rest was probably a lot easier. But even gods and demigods weren't always on the same page when it came to sleep. While Hypnos was busy ensuring the peace, the mortal world wasn't so kind. People who angered the gods, or who found themselves in tricky situations, might find themselves deprived of sleep as punishment. That's right, if a god or goddess didn't like you, they could just send nightmares, keeping you wide awake at all hours of the night. Imagine being cursed with sleepless nights where every corner of your room turns into an unfamiliar, shadowy nightmare. Kind of a cosmic prank, don't you think? It's a reminder that, even in the sleepy world of the gods, there was always some underlying mischief afoot. So, here's where we are. Hypnos, the gentle god of sleep, weaves through your dreams. His world is one of quiet serenity, a far cry from the hustle and bustle of Olympus. Even in the midst of divine chaos, there's a space for rest. But as you drift deeper into the night, you realize this. The more you rest, the more awake you become to the mysterious ways of the gods. Maybe sleep, like the gods themselves, is just another trick of fate that keeps us all wondering what comes next, and in that peaceful slumber, you might just catch a glimpse of the next chapter of your journey with the gods, where Hypnos's quiet touch might guide you once again. You've settled in now, your eyelids getting heavy as the myth unfolds. And trust me, tonight we're diving into something you may have heard of: Pandora's box. But before you start expecting some grand tale of explosive drama, let me tell you, this story is a little less exciting than you think. You've probably heard the basics. Pandora, the first woman on Earth, opens a box and lets loose all kinds of troubles upon the world. The twist: it's actually way more boring than you could imagine. But let's back up a little. Pandora wasn't your typical, average person. She was created by the gods themselves, designed as a gift to humankind. Sure, a gift might sound like a nice thing, but remember, this is the gods we're talking about. They weren't exactly known for handing out presents like Santa Claus. Pandora was gifted to the mortal world with a combination of beauty, curiosity, and a little bit of trouble. Imagine getting a brand new shiny object for your birthday, only to find out it's cursed. That's Pandora. She was given the box, beautiful and mysterious, by Zeus himself, but with a very specific instruction: never, ever open it. Now, why would anyone give a person something so enticing, so mysterious, and then tell them not to open it? You can already guess where this is going, right? Curiosity is a force stronger than even the gods, and Pandora, well, she was no exception. The real kicker, though, is that the box wasn't even some sort of dramatic Pandora's box in the sense we think about today. It wasn't a time bomb waiting to explode, nope. It was just a box that was tightly sealed. And the minute Pandora decided to peek inside, that's when things started getting boring. Inside, instead of chaos and monsters, all that came pouring out were things like sickness, old age, jealousy, things we all deal with every day but don't get much attention in the mythological spotlight. Think of it like opening an ancient box full of paperwork you forgot about, mundane, yet deeply inconvenient. Some scholars still argue whether this was the point of the myth. Was it supposed to explain all of humanity's woes, or was it just a cautionary tale about curiosity getting the best of us? Maybe it was just Zeus's idea of a cosmic prank, a way to remind people of the consequences of breaking promises. Either way, Pandora didn't really get the fun stuff. What everyone seems to forget is that, deep down in that box, there was one last thing that didn't escape: hope. And that's the twist you don't always hear about. Hope stayed at the bottom of the box, waiting to rise up when all the terrible stuff had already been let loose. Some say hope is the greatest gift Pandora could have received. After all, when things are at their worst, hope is what gets us through. The moment you think all is lost, it's that little spark of hope that lets you know there's still something worth trying for. But, come on, can you imagine? You're Pandora, and you've just opened this box, unleashing everything from disease to despair. What do? You're probably feeling a bit overwhelmed. It's like trying to clean up a spilled drink with a napkin and realizing the mess is bigger than the napkin itself. And just when you think it's all over, you realize there's hope, that one thing that's supposed to make everything better. But it's hidden, stuck at the bottom of a box. That's already caused chaos. And yet, somehow, Pandora had to find it, because let's face it, what's a world of endless problems without a little bit of hope to carry you through? The gods weren't just about power and beauty, they also played tricks with fate, sometimes giving people tools to fix their messes, and sometimes leaving them to fend for themselves. It's almost like getting a puzzle where all the pieces seem to fit, except for one, the missing piece that makes you question whether it was ever meant to be there. Now, here's the thing about Pandora. She wasn't some tragic hero. She wasn't the one who had to bear the full weight of humanity's suffering. That honor went to the mortals who followed after her, people like you and me. You probably think that's a bit unfair. Why did Pandora get off easy? She opened the box, right? Well, in a way, Pandora's story is a reminder that sometimes the things we open up to in life bring unexpected results, good and bad. It's like those late-night shopping sprees we all know too well, where you order something online, convinced you need it, only to realize, as soon as it arrives, that it's not exactly what you expected. That's Pandora. She didn't ask for it, but the moment she opened that box, she invited every little imperfection into the world. Some still argue whether hope was truly a gift or a curse. After all, it's one thing to hope when things are already going badly, but it's another to carry that burden indefinitely, always waiting for things to get better without knowing when they will. And maybe that's the true lesson of the myth, not that hope fixes everything, but that it's something we always have, even when we feel like we've lost everything else. But who's to say whether Pandora was ever able to live with her choices? The myth doesn't really tell us what happened to her after the box was opened. Did she live happily ever after, knowing hope was still in the world? Or did she wander around with the guilt of unleashing so much chaos? Some say she continued to live, never fully understanding what she had unleashed. In that sense, Pandora's life is like our own. We can never really predict the consequences of our actions, but we carry on regardless. Maybe that's where the myth speaks to us the most sometimes. You don't know what will happen when you open that metaphorical box in your own life. You might discover the worst of things, or maybe just a lesson in patience and hope. But in the end, it's all part of the journey. So, as you drift deeper into the night, consider this: we all carry a bit of Pandora in us, curious, hopeful, and ready to face whatever the world might throw our way. Whether it's a box full of troubles or a promise of better things, the story's never really over, is it? And just like hope in Pandora's box, it's always waiting to show up when you least expect it. So, here we are, ready to explore the tale of Sisyphus, the man who can't seem to catch a break. Now, before you start thinking this is a heroic saga filled with daring escapes and grand triumphs, let me stop you right there. This story, it's actually pretty boring, and if you were in Sisyphus's shoes, you'd probably be thinking, really? This is my life now. So, picture it. You're standing at the edge of a vast, rocky hill, looking up at a giant boulder. Not the kind of challenge you'd expect for a hero, right? Well, that's exactly what Sisyphus was facing, and trust me, you wouldn't want to trade places with him. See, Sisyphus wasn't your typical mythical figure. He wasn't out there saving kingdoms or battling monsters. He wasn't even trying to win a race or fight a giant. No, Sisyphus was just a regular king of Corinth, to be exact. Managed to piss off the gods. And for that, he got the most irritating, repetitive punishment you could imagine. His crime: he decided to trick death itself, which, in Greek mythology, is always a bad move. You'd think a man as smart as Sisyphus would know better. But instead of following the usual rules, he outwitted Thanatos, the god of death, and locked him up in chains. Yes, you read that right, he literally locked up death. Sounds pretty clever, doesn't it? But here's the problem. Death is kind of an essential part of the universe's balance, and by messing with it, Sisyphus upset the natural order. Not only did he prevent people from dying, but he also made a huge mess of the cosmic flow. The gods weren't too happy about this, and they punished him with something that would make anyone's eyelids droop: an endless, monotonous task. For all eternity, Sisyphus would be forced to push a giant boulder up a hill. And here's the catch. Every time he nearly reached the top, the boulder would roll right back down, sending him back to the bottom to start all over again. Can you imagine? This is the kind of thing that would make even the most enthusiastic person start questioning their life choices. Each time Sisyphus thought he had a shot at completing his task, the universe, feeling a bit petty, maybe decided that the finish line would always be just out of reach. Some scholars still argue whether the myth of Sisyphus represents the futility of life or the idea that we're all constantly battling uphill struggles that we can never truly escape from. It's like trying to get through a pile of paperwork that never seems to shrink, no matter how much you complete. The boulder rolls back down, and all you can do is sigh and start again. Sounds familiar, right? The thing about Sisyphus is that, unlike other heroes in Greek mythology, He doesn't have some epic battle or dramatic transformation. His struggle isn't about achieving greatness, but about enduring endless repetition. Imagine being stuck in a loop, forever pushing the same boulder over and over again, with no real sense of progress. It's like waiting for a train that keeps getting delayed, only to find out that no train is coming at all. Over and over and over again. So, why does this myth still stick with us? Well, here's the twist. Sisyphus, despite the absolute misery of his existence, is often depicted as having a certain defiant attitude. He doesn't give up. Every time that boulder rolls down the hill, he gets back up and starts again. It's almost as though he's saying, "You can make me do this forever, but I'm not going to break. I'm going to keep going, even if it doesn't make any sense." This is what makes the myth of Sisyphus so strangely inspiring. You may be thinking, but what's the point of pushing that rock all the way to the top if it just keeps rolling back down? And that's exactly the point. The gods didn't want him to succeed. They gave him the most monotonous, repetitive task they could think of because they knew it would break his spirit. But Sisyphus never gave them the satisfaction. In a weird way, that refusal to give up is where the power of the myth lies. It's not about completing the task. It's about how you keep facing it, no matter how futile it feels. There's something oddly comforting in that, don't you think? Life can sometimes feel like that, like you're pushing a heavy rock up a hill, only for it to slip back down over and over. Whether it's work, school, relationships, or just trying to get through the day, sometimes it feels like there's no end in sight. But Sisyphus, in his own quiet way, teaches us that it's not about the boulder or the hill, it's about the determination to keep moving. And as you drift deeper into this myth, you realize that the true punishment for Sisyphus isn't the task itself, it's the belief that he can never escape it. Imagine feeling like you're caught in an unbreakable cycle, a wheel that keeps spinning but never gets anywhere. But there's a funny thing that happens in this never-ending loop. It's the one thing that gives Sisyphus power over his own fate. He might not have been able to escape the task, but he didn't let it break him. You might not have control over all the things in your life, but the way you respond to them, that's where the freedom lies. So, Sisyphus is stuck with his boulder, endlessly repeating the same motions, but somewhere in that repetition, there's a sense of peace because, in the end, it's not about how far you go. It's about how you carry on, no matter how many times you have to start over. And as you let yourself sink deeper into the soft rhythm of sleep, you can almost imagine Sisyphus quietly pushing that boulder once again, finding meaning in his never-ending task. And maybe, just maybe, that's the secret to his endurance. The willingness to carry on, no matter how boring or futile it seems. Maybe, in a strange way, we're all a little bit like Sisyphus, pushing our own boulders in the endless cycle of life, but finding peace in the persistence. Now, let's ease into the strange and rather underwhelming tale of King Midas, the one with the golden touch. If you've ever heard of Midas, you probably think of the obvious, the man who could turn everything he touched into gold. But before you get too excited, let me tell you right off the bat, it's actually not as glamorous as it sounds. The myth doesn't exactly scream Hollywood blockbuster, and in fact, it might just leave you feeling a bit bored. Midas wasn't some ambitious conqueror or mighty warrior. He was, in many ways, just a regular king with a penchant for making poor decisions. In this version of his story, the gods decided to give Midas a wish. Now, you'd think a king with all the power in the world would wish for something that would benefit his kingdom: wealth, prosperity, maybe even the end of famine. But Midas, in his infinite wisdom, wished for the ability to turn anything he touched into gold. It seemed like a brilliant idea at the time, right? Who wouldn't want to make everything shiny and valuable? But here's the thing, Midas didn't think it through. Imagine that for a second. You're so overwhelmed with the idea of wealth and material success that you don't even stop to consider the consequences. You're living in a world where even the simplest thing can go wrong. And yet Midas didn't pause to think about what this might mean for him. As soon as the gift was granted, Midas was overjoyed. He immediately touched everything in sight: chairs, trees, his palace walls. Everything turned to solid gold. At first, it was exhilarating. He marveled at the way his touch transformed the world around him into pure treasure. It was like living in a dream world, where everything glistened and shimmered. He couldn't believe his luck. But, as it always happens in these myths, things started to take a turn for the worse. Soon, Midas tried to eat. He reached for an apple, and guess what? It turned to gold in his hands. He tried to drink some water, but it turned to gold as well. The very food that once nourished him became nothing but a cold, lifeless metal. The reality hit him like a ton of bricks. He couldn't eat, he couldn't drink, and he couldn't touch anyone or anything without it turning into something useless. His glorious gift became his greatest curse. And, to top it all off, Midas's daughter, the one person he loved more than anything, rushed to him in a moment of distress. She embraced him, and before his eyes, she turned into a golden statue. That was the breaking point for Midas. The man who once wished for gold now found himself in a cold, lonely world of glittering nothingness. Some scholars still argue whether Midas's downfall was a warning about the dangers of greed, or if it was just a commentary on the limitations of wealth. It's almost too obvious, right? Wealth isn't everything. But the myth suggests something deeper. Sometimes, what we desire the most can actually be the very thing that destroys us. Midas's wish wasn't just about turning things into gold. It was about his obsession with material wealth and the belief that gold would bring him happiness. But as we all know, the richest person can still feel hollow inside. After realizing the consequences of his wish, Midas tried everything he could to reverse it. He begged Dionysus, the god who had granted him the wish, to take it away. And after some pleading, Dionysus, rather generously, granted Midas a second chance. He told Midas to wash himself in the waters of the Pactolus River, and as he did, the golden touch faded away. The river's waters carried away the curse, and Midas was freed from his obsession with gold. At first glance, the myth of Midas seems like a simple tale of a king who got too greedy and paid the price. But when you really think about it, it's not just about gold. It's about desire itself, the kind of desire that makes us think that having more of something will finally fill the emptiness inside. But the truth is, nothing external, no amount of wealth or material success can truly bring happiness. Midas learned the hard way that once you've reached the top of the mountain, there's nowhere else to go but down. And sometimes, in that fall, you realize that what you thought you wanted was never the answer. So, as you settle deeper into sleep, think about Midas's story. Imagine yourself in his shoes, surrounded by golden things, but unable to touch a single one without it turning into something useless. The constant chase for more, for the next shiny thing, can sometimes distract us from what truly matters. It's like buying the latest gadget, only to realize that it's just another thing collecting dust on a shelf. The desire to accumulate, Wealth and status can take us to places where we lose sight of what's really important, the things that can't be measured in gold or money. And as Midas learned, sometimes the most precious things in life, love, family, the simple joys, the ones we take for granted. There's a lesson in this myth, isn't there? Sometimes it's not the pursuit of wealth that brings happiness. It's the ability to appreciate what we already have. It's about finding value in the intangible things, the things that can't be touched, measured, or turned into gold. And so, as you drift off to sleep, maybe you'll realize that you, like Midas, don't need to chase after something shiny to feel whole. It's the simple things that matter most, the things you already have. Just like that, Midas's story, though simple and maybe a little boring on the surface, carries a lesson that still resonates with us today. Let's settle in for a quieter kind of story tonight, one that doesn't involve gods or kings, but rather someone a little more unexpected. Tiresias, the blind prophet of Thebes. Now, you're probably imagining some epic figure who could see the future and solve all the world's problems with his wise words. Well, not exactly. Tiresias's life wasn't one of grand prophecies or thrilling adventures. It was, in many ways, the opposite. He wasn't a hero. He was a man who saw everything and yet, ironically, couldn't see a thing. Tiresias's story starts off like something out of an ancient soap opera. He was once a mortal man, enjoying his life like anyone else, until one day he stumbled upon a rather peculiar scene. He saw two snakes copulating in the forest. Well, he did what anyone might do. He struck them with his staff, as one does in ancient Greece. But here's the twist. In doing so, he angered the goddess Hera, who decided to punish him for his interference in the natural world. Hera's punishment was severe. She transformed him into a woman. Yes, you heard that right. Tiresias, a man, suddenly found himself in a woman's body. And it wasn't just a quick change, he was stuck like that for 7 years. Now, imagine the shock of suddenly being on the other side of things, experiencing the world in a completely different way. Tiresias didn't just walk around in a new body, he had to live through the complexities of being a woman in an ancient society. It's almost like if you suddenly switched lives with someone else, and not just anyone, but someone of the opposite gender, having to deal with all the expectations and rules of a life you never imagined. Tiresias got a first-hand experience of both sides of the human experience. But it didn't stop there. After 7 years, Tiresias stumbled across those same two snakes again. And this time, he didn't strike them, he simply left them alone. For this, Hera, perhaps growing bored of her own cruelty, decided to give him his original form back. But the strange twist of his story didn't end with the physical transformation. Tiresias, being transformed back into a man, somehow found himself gifted with the power of prophecy. Some scholars still argue whether this gift of foresight was a reward or simply a continuation of his punishment after all. If you could see the future, would that make your life easier or more difficult? Tiresias now had the ability to foresee the future, but there was a catch. He couldn't always tell others what he saw. It's almost like being given the most precious knowledge, but being forced to hold it inside, unable to share it with those who needed it most. The irony of his gift was that while he knew the future, he was never able to do much about it. The most famous moment in his prophetic career came when he warned King Oedipus about the consequences of his actions. Oedipus, though, wasn't exactly the type to listen to a blind man, especially one who'd seen the future. Tiresias tried to explain that Oedipus had unknowingly fulfilled the prophecy of killing his father and marrying his mother. But Oedipus, in his arrogance, refused to believe him. Tiresias knew the truth, but the king, unable to grasp it, turned away. And this refusal to listen, it led to one of the most tragic and ironic downfalls in Greek mythology. Tiresias, despite his all-knowing sight into the future, remained as helpless as the rest of us in the face of fate. Some still debate whether Tiresias's knowledge was truly a gift or a curse. He saw the future, sure, but was there any happiness in knowing what was to come? Or was it a constant reminder of the things he couldn't change? Imagine knowing everything but being unable to do anything to stop it. That's the harsh reality of Tiresias's existence. It's like knowing the outcome of a race before it even begins, but being forced to watch as others run the race anyway. Tiresias didn't have the luxury of ignorance, and in that sense, his life wasn't about glory, it was about the burdens of knowledge. There's a certain loneliness to his story, too. Tiresias was the one everyone turned to when they needed answers, yet, at the same time, he was often ignored or misunderstood. His prophetic visions were both a blessing and a burden. People only sought him out when they wanted to know the future, but when he spoke, his words were often met with resistance, like a stranger giving unsolicited advice that no one wants to hear. Tiresias knew things that others couldn't, but that knowledge didn't make him any less human. In fact, it might have made him more human than any of the gods or heroes in these myths. And isn't that the heart of this story? The idea that knowing the future doesn't necessarily make life easier. It just makes us more aware of our limitations. Tiresias wasn't all-powerful, and in many ways, he was more helpless than anyone else. He knew what would happen, but he couldn't change it. He wasn't a hero, but his story is one of quiet wisdom, not because he could see the future, but because he knew how to endure. As you slip into the warmth of sleep tonight, think of Tiresias and his endless foresight. Would you want to know the future if it meant facing it alone, with no way to change what was to come? Perhaps, in his own way, Tiresias teaches us that sometimes the power to see the future is less important than the power to live in the present. He couldn't stop fate, but he kept living through it, knowing full well what was ahead. And maybe, just maybe, that's the quiet strength we all need. It's not about knowing the future, it's about enduring whatever comes next. As you drift deeper into the world of Greek mythology, let's take a moment to settle in with the strangely familiar story of Narcissus. You've likely heard the name Narcissus, the handsome young man so obsessed with his own reflection that he literally fell in love with himself. But here's the thing. This myth isn't quite the grand heroic love story it might seem at first glance. It's a bit, well, boring in a way. Narcissus wasn't out there saving kingdoms or battling monsters. He was simply staring at his reflection in a pool of water. Yes, you heard that right. That's it. Now, before you roll your eyes and think, why is this myth even worth mentioning? Let me tell you, it's actually a lot deeper, or should I say, more reflective than it first appears. Narcissus was, in many ways, just like anyone else, a bit too caught up in his own beauty. He was the epitome of self-love, the kind of person who gazes at themselves in a mirror for far too long, admiring their own features, obsessed with the image staring back at them. And in Greek mythology, narcissism wasn't seen as something cute or endearing, it was a flaw. The gods were never shy about punishing those who went too far with their vanity. Narcissus's downfall began when he came across a pool of water and saw his own reflection. As the myth goes, Narcissus was so entranced by the sight of his own face, the sheer beauty of it, that he couldn't look away. He fell deeply, madly in love with the image staring back at him, not realizing that it was only a reflection. It's almost like those moments when you glance at your phone screen, see a selfie, and think, wow, I look great. But for Narcissus, it wasn't just a fleeting glance, it was an obsession. He became so fixated on his reflection that he couldn't pull himself away. Days went by, and Narcissus continued to stare into the water, unable to tear himself away from the illusion of beauty he'd found. He eventually became so mesmerized by his own image that he simply couldn't leave. In the end, he withered away, his body fading as he continued to gaze into the water, never once realizing that he was falling in love with nothing more than an illusion. Some scholars still argue whether the myth of Narcissus is really about vanity, or if it's a cautionary tale about the dangers of self-absorption. It's almost too easy to write it off as just another story of someone who loved themselves too much. But think about it, how many of us spend time obsessed with how we look, how we present ourselves to the world. Narcissus's story isn't just about vanity, it's about the danger of losing yourself in the image you project. And that's where the true tragedy lies. Narcissus didn't just look in the water and admire himself, he became trapped in that admiration, unable to break free from the reflection he saw. It's like when you get so caught up in your own image, whether it's on social media, in the mirror, or in the way you think others see you, that you forget what really matters. Narcissus didn't see himself as he truly was. He saw a perfect version of himself, a version he couldn't live up to. That illusion consumed him, and in the end, it was the very thing that led to his destruction. So, while Narcissus may seem like a character who simply couldn't stop staring at himself, his story is actually a commentary on the emptiness of living for the approval of your own reflection, the dangers of losing yourself in something that isn't real. There's also the curious twist to the myth of Narcissus. While he was obsessed with his reflection, the gods didn't just let him suffer in silence. They, too, had a hand in his fate. As the story goes, the goddess Echo, who had fallen in love with Narcissus, was heartbroken when he rejected her. Echo, the poor nymph, had the curse of repeating only the last words spoken to her, and she could do nothing but echo Narcissus's words of rejection. So, Echo was left wandering, alone, fading away into nothing, just as Narcissus did. Some say this part of the myth adds a layer of sadness, a tragedy within a tragedy. While Narcissus gazed at his reflection, Echo quietly withered away, her love unreturned. It's like when you give all of yourself to someone, but they don't even notice. What's worse than love unrequited? Narcissus's tale isn't just about vanity, it's about the deep loneliness of unreciprocated love, and how it can consume you just as much as narcissism can. Echo's fate serves as a stark contrast to Narcissus's demise. She loved without receiving anything in return, while Narcissus was trapped in a love he could never truly experience. The two characters mirror each other in a way, both caught in the web of unfulfilled desires. But at least Narcissus had the luxury of being in love with something his own reflection, Echo. She had nothing but the echoes of her love, a love she could never share, not even with the person who should have returned it. In the end, both Narcissus and Echo faded away, and the myth remains as a reminder of the dangers of obsession, whether with self-image or with a love that's never returned. The beauty of Narcissus's story, despite its tragic end, is that it's not just about vanity. It's about understanding who you are beyond your image, beyond what others see. So, as you settle further into your dreams tonight, take a moment to think about Narcissus and Echo. Imagine, just for a moment, what it would be like to lose yourself in a reflection of your own making, or to love without ever being seen. Both are traps, and both can leave you hollow inside. But like the myth itself, the key to breaking free from such obsessions is to remember that there's more to life than the image in the mirror, or the love you seek from others. It's about finding the reflection that truly matters yourself as you are. Now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about someone who's supposed to be a hero. But, well, let's just say he wasn't always at the top of his game. Heracles, or, as you might know him, Hercules. The guy who went through 12 impossible tasks, and yet somehow he's still best known for his muscles. But here's the thing. Those 12 tasks weren't as glorious as you might think. Sure, they sound impressive on paper, but let me tell you, Heracles wasn't exactly winning any popularity contests with these feats. He wasn't out there rescuing princesses or slaying dragons in the traditional sense. Instead, his tasks were a series of, well, chores. Think of it like getting handed a list of things to do on a Saturday, and instead of something fun like hiking or going to a concert, you get, go clean up that enormous mess in the barn and slay some really gross monsters. So, it all started when Heracles, after a particularly chaotic episode involving a family tragedy and a very angry Hera, was sentenced by the Oracle of Delphi to complete 12 tasks to atone for his sins. 12 tasks that were so outrageous that, even today, people joke about how they're the kind of things you'd only do if you had absolutely nothing better to do. His first task, killing the Nemean lion, a beast with a hide so tough that weapons couldn't pierce it. Now, this doesn't sound too bad until you remember that Heracles wasn't exactly prepared for this kind of thing. I mean, sure, he was strong, but he wasn't exactly an expert in monster hunting. So, instead of using his sword or any fancy tactics, he had to get up close and personal, wrestling the lion and eventually strangling it with his bare hands. It's kind of like being asked to fix a broken sink using nothing but duct tape and your bare hands, good, messy, and not at all glamorous. But what really makes this task boring in its own way is that it wasn't a grand battle, and it wasn't even a clever victory. It was just brute force, and after the lion was dead, he wore its skin as a cloak. Honestly, though, it sounds more like he just got lucky. But, of course, the tasks didn't stop there. Next, he had to slay the 9-headed Hydra, a creature that grew 2 heads every time one was chopped off. Now, you might think, okay, now we're getting somewhere. This sounds more like a monster-slaying adventure. And, sure, it's a bit more exciting. But here's the catch. The Hydra wasn't just about hacking off heads. It was a test of patience. Every time Heracles took a swing, more heads popped up. It's like trying to clear out a garden full of weeds, and for every one you pull, 2 more pop up in its place. Heracles, with the help of his nephew Iolaus, finally solved the problem by cauterizing the stumps to stop the heads from growing back. It wasn't glory, it was just teamwork, and a lot of trial and error. But then again, aren't most things in life a lot like that? Full of mistakes and messy attempts, until, at long last, you get it right. The third task was to capture the golden hind of Artemis, a magical deer that was so fast, no one could catch it. You might think this is a task about running and chasing. Right, a bit of a race with a magical deer. But no, this was all about patience, something that Heracles didn't always have. It took him over a year to catch the deer, all the while trying not to anger the goddess Artemis, who was very protective of her animals. This wasn't a victory of strength or power. It was about persistence and careful strategy, and honestly, if we're being real, isn't that the boring side of most heroic feats? It's not always about charging in and slaying monsters. It's about slow, steady work and trying not to mess up. And so it went, one task after another. The Erymanthian boar, the cleaning of the Augean stables, the capture of the hind, the slaying of the Stymphalian birds. None of these tasks were easy, but none of them were especially glamorous either. Each one was a dirty job, a messy job, a tedious job. Even the capture of the Cretan bull wasn't as exciting as it sounds. And then there was the capture of the girdle of Hippolyta, the Amazonian queen. Sounds heroic, doesn't it? But again, it wasn't about slaying enemies or achieving something truly noble. It was about collecting a belt, a magical belt. After that came the task of stealing cattle from Geryon, the three-bodied monster. Sounds like a massive battle, but in reality, it was just a long journey to steal some cows. And let's not forget the final tasks, like capturing Cerberus, the three-headed dog guarding the underworld. What does it take to capture a three-headed dog, you ask? Well, apparently, just a lot of muscle and a willingness to endure hours of exhausting, thankless work. When you look at it all, it's hard to think of these 12 tasks as anything more than a bunch of chores strung together, each one more grueling than the last. The tasks weren't about glory, they were about survival. They were about persistence in the face of exhaustion. It's almost like a bad job you can't quit. It's like being handed an endless list of things to do and realizing that no matter how hard you try, the work will never end. Heracles didn't walk away from his 12 tasks with fame or fortune. He walked away knowing that sometimes the most heroic of tasks were the ones that required the most patience and humility. The truly boring part of Heracles' story isn't the slaying of monsters or fighting evil. It's the mundane reality that not every victory is glorious. Sometimes, victory is simply the ability to keep going, no matter how many times you're knocked down. As you fall further into sleep tonight, consider this. Every hero has a boring side. Every great accomplishment is rooted in a lot of hard, monotonous work. And while Heracles may have gotten his name etched into myth for completing 12 incredible tasks, the truth is, he's like the rest of us, just trying to get through one task at a time, hoping the next one won't be as tedious as the last. It's not about the big battles or the final victories. It's about what you do in the meantime, in the boring moments, when the world isn't watching. That's where the real strength lies. Let's take a moment now to settle into a different kind of love story, one that involves no grand declarations, no sweeping gestures, and no dramatic endings. Instead, we're talking about a transformation into birds. Yes, you read that right. This tale is about love, but not the typical kind of love you'd expect in Greek mythology. This one is strange, almost amusing, and definitely not the sort of romantic tale you'd read in a fairy tale book. It all starts with a mortal man named Alcyone and his wife, Halcyone, who were deeply in love with one another. In fact, they were so in love that they had an unusual agreement. They couldn't bear to be apart, and they swore that nothing would come between them, not even the gods. The gods, however, had other plans. You see, this wasn't just any love story, it was a tragic one, but it wasn't about a villain or a dramatic end. Instead, it's about a series of events that lead to a rather boring, mundane conclusion. In the grand scheme of things, Alcyone was a king, and as fate would have it, he set out on a journey by sea, leaving his beloved Halcyone behind. As he sailed across the ocean, a great storm came upon him. Naturally, the storm was fierce and unrelenting, causing panic among the sailors, and, tragically, Alcyone's ship was destroyed. The gods, watching from above, allowed it to happen. But here's where the story takes a quiet turn. Halcyone, unaware of her husband's fate, anxiously waited for his return. Every day she would gaze at the horizon, hoping to see the ship return. She had no way of knowing that the gods had already decided her fate. She could only hold on to the hope that he was still out there, somewhere, safe and sound. But the gods, in their ever-watchful eyes, were relentless in their own way. They decided to reveal to Halcyone the truth in a way that was so gentle and sudden that it almost felt like an afterthought in the narrative. One day, as Halcyone walked to the shore to wait for her husband's return, she saw a dead body washed up on the shore. It was her husband's body, cold and lifeless, no longer the man she had so lovingly waited for. In her grief and overwhelming sorrow, she threw herself into the sea, unable to bear the pain of losing him. In the final moments of the myth, the gods took pity on them both. They decided, in a rather odd twist, to transform the grieving couple into birds, known as halcyons. But here's the thing, this transformation wasn't grand. It wasn't the kind of magical shift you might expect in a myth, and it didn't involve a massive plot twist. The gods turned them into birds so that they could be together forever, soaring through the skies, but it was all very quiet. The two lovers, now birds, were no longer human, just creatures who had once shared a deep, seemingly impossible love. This wasn't a tragic end, but it wasn't a happy ending either. It was a transformation into something that was neither fully joyous nor fully sad. Some say that the halcyon birds, once formed, would lay their eggs on the calmest of seas, calm weather, symbolizing their eternal love for each other. The transformation didn't bring an end to their love, but neither did it bring back the life they once knew. Some scholars still debate whether this transformation was a symbol of hope or simply an end to a repetitive cycle. Was it about the promise of love everlasting, or was it about the quiet acceptance of what was lost? The love of Alcyone and Halcyone wasn't the kind of love that led to battles or emotional highs. It was just quiet, simple, and at the end, it became a story of quiet sorrow and acceptance. It's funny though, because there's something soothing about this myth. The gods turned them into birds, not to be gods themselves, but so they could simply fly through the skies together, forever. It's almost like they were given a second chance, but not in the way you might expect. There was no miraculous reversal of fate, just a soft and quiet ending. What's more interesting is the deeper message that underlies this tale. Love isn't always loud or grand or heroic. Sometimes it's small, quiet, and even a little boring. It's about the moments when no one is watching. When two people are simply in sync with one another, living their lives without seeking attention. Alcyone and Halcyone's love was not about grand gestures. It was about the little moments, the simple acts, the quiet joy of being with someone. So, when they are transformed into birds, it's almost as if the gods are telling us that love doesn't need to be extraordinary to be meaningful, it just needs to be there, steady and consistent, even through the hardest of times. Imagine that kind of love. You're not fighting for glory or fame, you're simply existing together, side by side, and sometimes that's all you need. And in a way, the couple's transformation into birds wasn't a tragic punishment or a heroic reward, it was simply a gentle reminder that love doesn't have to be grand. It doesn't have to involve fighting gods or conquering impossible odds. Sometimes, love is just about being with someone, through all the quiet moments and the painful ones, until you become something that transcends what you were before. In the calm and gentle flight of the halcyon birds, you might find a strange peace. They were given the chance to be together forever, but it wasn't in a palace or a castle. It wasn't in some grand mythical world. It was in the simple act of flying through the sky. The peace they found in each other was quiet, serene, and forever. So, as you sink deeper into your rest tonight, remember Alcyone and Halcyon. Story love is not always about loud declarations or dramatic events. It's about the quiet moments that make you feel like you belong, no matter where you are. And sometimes, the best part of a love story is the part that's so simple, you might miss it if you're looking for something bigger than it needs to be. Now, let's dive into a tale that's a bit more on the tragic side, though not in the way you might expect. This story is about King Minos, the ruler of Crete, and his labyrinthine problems, not just the literal maze that everyone remembers, but the far more frustrating, mundane mess of consequences that come from making bad decisions. Minos is often remembered for his colossal maze, designed to house the Minotaur, that terrifying half-man, half-bull creature. But the truth is, Minos wasn't just some eccentric king obsessed with building labyrinths. His life was tangled up in a web of mistakes, bad choices, and petty godly feuds. Now, let's be clear, Minos wasn't all bad. He wasn't some wicked villain or tyrant, but he wasn't exactly a paragon of virtue either. His kingdom was prosperous, and he had the power of the gods backing him, but it was all built on a foundation of questionable decisions that would eventually unravel. It all started when Minos' father, the god Zeus, sent a beautiful white bull to Minos as a sign of favor, a gift meant to be sacrificed in honor of the gods. But here's where things get, well, boring. Instead of honoring the gods, Minos, being the crafty ruler he was, decided to keep the bull for himself. After all, it was a magnificent animal, and who could blame him for wanting to keep such a prize? But this decision, small and seemingly insignificant at the time, set off a series of events that would lead to a disaster. Poseidon, the god of the sea, didn't take kindly to being ignored. So he punished Minos by making his wife, Persephone, fall madly in love with the very same bull. Now, I'm not sure if the gods were trying to be cruel or just had too much time on their hands, but this is where things take a turn into strange territory. Persephone, in her obsession with the bull, ordered the creation of a wooden cowsuit, climbed into it, and successfully seduced the bull. Yes, this is exactly as weird as it sounds. But remember, we're talking about Greek mythology here, where anything can happen. And so, from that union came the Minotaur, the half-man, half-bull creature that would become the nightmare of Crete. But Minos, being a king, wasn't about to admit his mistakes. He didn't want to face the consequences of his foolishness, so he decided to lock the Minotaur away in a labyrinth, a maze so complicated that no one could escape. And this, in turn, led to more mess. Every year, Minos would demand tribute. From Athens, 7 young men and 7 young women sent as sacrifices to the Minotaur. This was his way of keeping the beast at bay, feeding it the tribute it demanded. But again, you have to see the absurdity here. Minos wasn't just punishing his enemies, he was punishing his own people by sending them into a maze to be slaughtered. It wasn't a noble sacrifice. It was a cruel and repetitive cycle, one that only perpetuated his own guilt. Now, This is where the story takes a shift. These annual sacrifices were taking a toll on Athens, and eventually Theseus, the hero of Athens, volunteered to go into the labyrinth and kill the Minotaur. Armed with the sword of Aegeus, and aided by the love of Ariadne, Minos' own daughter, Theseus, ventured into the maze, and with a clever strategy, killed the Minotaur. But here's the kicker. Minos, after all the trouble he had caused, didn't even learn his lesson. After the Minotaur's death, Minos' kingdom started to crumble, slowly but steadily. Instead of focusing on the things that truly mattered, like his people or the consequences of his actions, he continued to make decisions based on pride and revenge. Minos' story is a perfect example of how a person, even a king, can get so wrapped up in the consequences of their own bad decisions that they end up trapped in an endless cycle of mistakes. The labyrinth, which he had so proudly built, became a symbol of his own entrapment. The more he tried to control his world, the more out of control everything became. Some scholars still debate whether Minos' story is a lesson in leadership, or simply a cautionary tale about hubris. After all, he wasn't just punished by the gods, he punished himself by creating a maze he couldn't escape. It's not just the literal labyrinth that we're talking about. Here it's the metaphorical one. The labyrinth represents the maze of bad choices that Minos found himself stuck in. And even when he had the chance to make things right, he continued to wander in circles, unable to break free from the web of his own making. Minos, despite all his power and grandeur, was ultimately a king who couldn't escape his own mistakes. He was a man trapped by pride, consumed by his own decisions, to see that the real way out was to own up to his actions. In the end, Minos died, but not with the grand death of a tragic hero. He was consumed by his own failure, trapped in the very labyrinth he had built to contain his mistakes. His story is a reminder that sometimes, the more you try to control things, the more you end up being controlled by them. The real tragedy of Minos wasn't the death of the Minotaur or the sacrifices to the gods, it was the fact that, in the end, he never found his way out of the labyrinth he had created for himself. It's easy to think that a hero's journey always involves epic battles and grand victories. But Minos' journey shows us that sometimes the greatest struggle is simply learning to break free from the consequences of our own pride and missteps. So, as you let yourself relax into sleep tonight, think of Minos, his kingdom, and his labyrinth. Sometimes, the hardest part of life isn't the challenges others place in our path, it's the ones we build for ourselves, the ones we get lost in. And maybe, just maybe, the key to getting out is learning to face the consequences of our choices before we become trapped forever. Now, let's step into the quieter, more understated part of Greek mythology, the Trojan War. This is the one myth that everyone knows about, right? But here's the thing. It's not the dramatic, blood-pumping war story you'd expect from all those Hollywood renditions. The Trojan War, like most things in life, was a lot more drawn out and tedious than we give it credit for. You've heard the tale before. The Greeks and the Trojans went to war, all over Helen, the most beautiful woman in the world, who was taken by Paris, the Prince of Troy. The war lasted 10 long years, with countless heroes and famous battles: Achilles, Hector, Odysseus, and so on. But what's often left out of this story is how utterly boring and drawn out the entire thing must have been. Imagine a war that lasts for a decade. 10 years of sitting around, waiting for something to happen, with a few exciting moments sprinkled in here and there. This wasn't some glorified, one battle confrontation where everything is settled in an afternoon. No, this was a long, drawn-out conflict, where the majority of the time was spent waiting, plotting, and dealing with setbacks. After Paris, in his youthful arrogance, abducted Helen, the kings of Greece, led by Menelaus, her husband, decided they would get her back. So, they sailed across the Aegean Sea, assembled an army, and laid siege to Troy. But instead of a quick, decisive battle, the Greeks and Trojans settled into a war of attrition. It was a battle of small skirmishes, endless negotiations, and prolonged moments of tense waiting. There were no grand victories. There was no one moment when the tide of battle turned. Every day was the same heroes charging into battle, barely surviving, and then retreating to their camps. The most famous image of this war is probably the Trojan horse, the giant wooden structure that the Greeks used to infiltrate Troy. And while that part of the myth is dramatic and cunning, the reality of the Trojan War was probably much more boring. Before the Greeks ever thought of that clever trick, they spent years trying to breach Troy's mighty walls. They tried everything, besieging the city, attempting to starve out the Trojans. And then just when they thought it was over, treaties and truce proposals. The Trojans, ever confident in their city's impenetrability, weren't in much of a rush to surrender. This was the crux of the war. Years of back and forth, with no end in sight. One might wonder why the war didn't end sooner. The reasons are as simple as they are frustrating: pride, stubbornness, and the refusal to back down. The Greeks were adamant about getting Helen back, and the Trojans were equally stubborn in their defense of their honor. But this kind of deadlock doesn't make for an exciting story. There were no epic moments where one side overpowered the other, no legendary one-on-one combat to resolve the conflict. Instead, the war dragged on and on, like an old car engine sputtering along, never quite able to reach full speed. Both sides suffered terrible losses. Achilles, the greatest of the Greek warriors, spent most of the war sulking in his tent, refusing to fight after a quarrel with Agamemnon, the leader of the Greeks. Meanwhile, Hector, the Trojan prince and hero, fought valiantly, but even he couldn't prevent the inevitable. The Greek armies began to win small battles, but it was clear that no single fight would determine the outcome of the war. It would take time, frustration, and weariness. The real turning point of the war came not with a mighty battle, but with the introduction of the Trojan horse, a cunning trick that allowed the Greeks to sneak inside Troy's walls. After years of battling, it was a simple ruse that finally broke the deadlock. The Greeks built a giant wooden horse, hollowed out and filled with soldiers. The Trojans, thinking they had one, brought the horse inside the city walls as a symbol of their victory. That night, the Greek soldiers hidden inside the horse emerged and opened the gates, allowing the Greek army to invade the city and bring the war to an end. The Trojans, in their pride and arrogance, never even considered the possibility of such a trick. The fall of Troy wasn't the grand heroic battle we imagine. It was a quiet betrayal, a trick that capitalized on the Trojans' unwillingness to believe that the Greeks might think of such an ingenious plan. The Trojan horse was the final stroke of a war that had dragged on far too long, a war that had no real winners. Sure, the Greeks won the battle, but what did they gain? Their cities were in ruins, their armies decimated, and their soldiers scarred. As for the Trojans, their city was destroyed, and the survivors scattered, leaving nothing but ashes in their wake. Some scholars argue whether the Trojan War was a story of heroism or a reminder of the futility of war. While it's easy to romanticize the tales of Achilles and Hector, the truth of the Trojan War is a long, drawn-out conflict that accomplished little except for a brief, hollow victory. It's a reminder that sometimes, no matter how grand the cause, war is often a waste of time and lives. And what does that say about the heroes we idolize? Achilles, the mighty warrior, was undone by his pride and stubbornness. Hector, the noble defender of Troy, met his end in a battle that was ultimately meaningless. As you settle further into sleep, think of the Trojan War, those long years spent in an endless cycle of fighting, scheming, and waiting. Was it worth it? Was there a real hero in the end? Or was it just a long, slow march toward inevitable destruction? Perhaps the true lesson of the Trojan War is that battles, like time itself, are often boring in their repetition. And the real question is not whether you win or lose, but how much time you've wasted trying to win something that never really mattered. Now, let's move on to a lesser-known chapter of Greek mythology that's often overshadowed by the big names, the minor gods who played their parts in the grand drama of the world but never quite made it into the spotlight. These were the gods who didn't slay monsters or lead armies, no. They were the ones who were relegated to the background, silently keeping the world running. Their stories weren't full of heroic feats, but rather quiet contributions to the natural world. They were the ones responsible for the changing seasons, the winds, the rivers, and even the minor forces that affected the lives of mortals in small, everyday ways. It's easy to forget about these gods because they didn't make flashy entrances or exit with a thunderous roar. Instead, they had mundane tasks that were no less important but infinitely more boring. Take, for instance, the personification of the wind's anemoi. These were the gods of the four cardinal directions: Boreas the north wind, Notus the south wind, Eurus the east wind, and Zephyrus the west wind. They were powerful forces, no doubt, but they weren't exactly the type of gods you'd see headlining a Greek tragedy. They didn't get to storm Olympus with thunderbolts or shapeshift into majestic creatures. Instead, they simply blew in from their respective directions, sometimes gently, sometimes fiercely, changing the weather, guiding sailors, or providing the occasional breeze on a hot summer's day. Hardly the kind of thing that's remembered for the ages. And yet, without them, there would have been no change in the seasons, no cooling winds to temper the heat of summer, and no winds to guide ships on their voyages. But the story of the anemoi is often dismissed as minor, just a footnote in the grand scheme of mythology. Then there's the river gods. These weren't your heroic river gods, like the Nile or the great rivers of ancient civilizations. These were the minor river gods, like Achilles, the god of the largest river in Greece. Achilles had a role to play in many myths, often as the one who would aid the heroes or provide wisdom. He wasn't out there fighting evil or making grand prophecies. Instead, his influence was felt in quiet moments flowing through the land, nourishing the crops, providing water for the people. And yet, he, too, was part of a much larger system, the intricate web of divine and mortal affairs that kept the world turning. Achilles, in his quiet, unassuming way, gave the gift of life. But for all his importance, his story wasn't one of dramatic battles or great victories. It was simply the act of flowing onward, never ceasing, never asking for recognition. And this is where the minor gods make their entrance, not in the heat of battle, but in the subtle moments of existence. They are the ones who keep things going without anyone noticing. They are the background hum of the universe. Think about it. How often do you notice the wind or the rivers that surround you, shaping the environment in ways you don't even realize? These gods aren't grand, they don't need to be. Their contributions are constant, ever-present, and essential to the world's survival, but they never ask for attention. Just like the lesser gods, the spirits of nature, and the everyday miracles that go unnoticed, they hum quietly in the background. These gods were never meant to be remembered for their extraordinary feats. They were never designed to steal the spotlight. Instead, they were meant to embody the beauty of the everyday, the mundane, and the simple things that hold the world together. Without them, the drama of the great heroes would be meaningless. It would be like a play with no backdrop, no stage, no lighting. The minor gods might not have had flashy moments of glory, but they were the quiet forces that kept the world running smoothly. Consider the river gods, Achilles, who helped Hercules in his battles, but who also ensured that the rivers continued to flow, nourishing the lands. Without the flow of water, there would be no crops, no farms, no life as we know it. And what about the wind gods, who, though they were sometimes seen as playful, could also bring storms or calm seas when needed? It's easy to overlook these gods when we're focused on the drama of larger-than-life figures like Zeus or Apollo. But in reality, it's these minor deities that make the world work. What's more interesting is how these minor gods were often used to explain things that we now take for granted. They weren't revered in grand temples or sung about in epic poems. Instead, they were part of the daily lives of mortals, making sense of the world in small, understated ways. The quiet changing of the seasons was explained by the anemoi, the flowing of the rivers by the river gods. And the beauty of this mythology lies in the simplicity of these forces. They weren't complicated or over the art. They were just a part of the world, part of the cycle of nature, and yet without them, nothing else would make sense. They were, in their own way, the most important gods of all the ones who shaped the world in ways that were constant, steady, and reliable. So, as you settle into sleep tonight, consider the quiet gods of nature, the ones who don't ask for recognition but who shape the world every day, the ones who don't demand the spotlight but whose influence is felt in the gentle winds and the flowing rivers. Maybe we all need a little bit of that in our lives. Reminder that it's not always the loudest or most dramatic moments that define us. Sometimes it's the quiet, steady presence that holds everything together. So, as you drift off into your dreams, let the quiet, unnoticed gods of nature remind you that even the smallest forces can have the greatest impact. Now, let's delve into a story that combines art, ambition, and a bit of misfortune, the tale of Arachne. You may already know her as the woman who became a spider, but the story behind her transformation is a lot less glamorous than it sounds. It starts with Arachne, a talented young weaver who had the audacity to challenge the goddess Athena herself. Now, you might think that a woman challenging the gods is the beginning of a grand tale of rebellion or heroism. But in Arachne's case, it was more like a cautionary tale about pride and overconfidence. See, Arachne wasn't just a good weaver, she was the best. Her skill with the loom was so unmatched that she was praised far and wide, even by those who worked beside her. People would gather round to watch her work, amazed by the intricate patterns she wove into cloth. But as with most things in Greek mythology, pride comes before the fall. Arachne, hearing the whispers of admiration and flattery, began to think that her skill could rival even that of the gods. The more she heard praise, the more her ego grew. It wasn't long before she made a bold declaration. She was so skilled that she could weave a tapestry that was even more beautiful than anything Athena, the goddess of wisdom and craft, could create. Now, if you know anything about the gods, you know that they aren't the types to let such a challenge slide. Athena naturally heard the boast and wasn't pleased by it. She appeared to Arachne, disguised as an old woman, warning her to humble herself and acknowledge the superiority of the gods. But Arachne, ever confident in her own ability, refused. She not only refused to back down, but doubled down on her arrogance, taunting the goddess that her weaving could not be surpassed. Athena, angry and offended by the mortal's hubris, decided to challenge Arachne to a contest. The rules were simple. Both would weave their finest work, and the gods themselves would judge which was superior. The stage was set for a battle of skill, but here's the thing, there was no true competition. Arachne, filled with pride, believed that her work would surpass Athena's in every way. Athena, on the other hand, was not just a skilled weaver. She was the goddess of wisdom and craft. She understood the stakes and prepared her work carefully. When the time came to reveal the finished tapestries, it was clear that Arachne's work was stunning truly. It was a masterpiece. She had woven a scene that depicted the gods in all their glory, but with an almost mocking tone, showing their flaws and mistakes. Athena's tapestry, on the other hand, depicted the gods in their divine radiance, showing them at their most perfect and powerful. The gods looked at the two works and, not surprisingly, judged Athena's to be flawless. But it wasn't just the gods who judged Arachne's tapestry had a dark edge. She had portrayed the gods' flaws in such intricate detail that it bordered on disrespect. Her work was a masterpiece in technique, but its subject matter mocked the gods themselves. Athena, furious at Arachne's audacity and irreverence, couldn't let it slide. So, she did what the gods often do in these myths. She punished the mortal who dared to challenge her. But here's the twist. Athena didn't strike her down with thunderbolts or banish her to the underworld. No, instead, she transformed Arachne into a spider. The goddess cursed Arachne to weave for the rest of her life, forever condemned to spin webs as a spider. It wasn't an immediate, dramatic death. It was a slow, continuous punishment, a reminder that her pride would forever trap her in a cycle of creating but never achieving greatness in the way she had once hoped. Some scholars still debate whether Athena's punishment was too harsh or simply deserved. Was Arachne's challenge really that offensive, or was it just the arrogance of youth? Was she simply an artist who got carried away with her own skill? Or did she truly deserve to be reduced to a mere spider? Athena's punishment wasn't just about silencing a boastful mortal. It was about forcing Arachne to confront the consequences of her pride every single day. And while the punishment may seem extreme, there's something oddly fitting about it. Arachne, once so focused on weaving her masterpieces, now spent every moment trapped in the very act she once loved. Her art was no longer something she could be praised for. It became a silent, repetitive task, one that was necessary for survival, but lacked the creative joy she had once found in it. The story of Arachne is often seen as a cautionary tale about humility. It's about knowing when to step back and acknowledge that there's always someone or something greater than yourself. Arachne's mistake wasn't just in her arrogance, it was in her refusal to recognize the boundaries of mortal skill versus divine power. She could have been content with her craft, celebrated for her talent, but she crossed a line when she believed that she could surpass the gods. And that's the lesson in Arachne's tale. No matter how skilled you are, There's always a limit to what you can achieve on your own. The gods were not to be challenged, not because they were cruel or arbitrary, but because they represented something greater than individual ability. The transformation into a spider, then, becomes a metaphor for the artist trapped by their own ambitions. It's a life of constant creation without fulfillment, endlessly spinning the same web over and over, never able to escape the cycle. It's the feeling of being trapped in a task you once loved but now find tedious and soul-crushing. And perhaps that's the most boring part of Arachne's punishment. She is doomed to repeat the same act of weaving without purpose, unable to ever truly enjoy her skill again. But here's the twist. Even in her punishment, there's a quiet beauty. While Arachne may have lost her human form and her chance for fame, she continues to weave, creating intricate webs that, in their own way, still demonstrate her remarkable talent. The story ends not with destruction, but with a quiet, ongoing process. Arachne's punishment is long, repetitive, and, in many ways, boring. But it's also a reminder that sometimes the consequences of our actions are not immediate. They are drawn out over time, and they can trap us in cycles of our own making. As you settle into the quiet of sleep, remember Arachne's story. Sometimes, ambition without humility can lead to a quiet, ongoing punishment. But even in those cycles, there can still be beauty, albeit in a different form than you might expect. Let's slow things down and talk about Orpheus, a figure whose story is not quite the heroic one you might imagine. Orpheus, the legendary musician of Greek mythology, is often remembered for his incredible ability to charm anyone and anything with the sound of his lyre. But for all the grandeur that we associate with his music, Orpheus's life, and especially the end of it, is a much quieter, more bittersweet tale. Orpheus's talent was unmatched. His music could move not only humans but even the gods. It's said that when he played his lyre, even stones would soften, trees would sway, and animals would gather around him in peaceful harmony. Orpheus's music wasn't just beautiful, it was magical. He could even charm Hades, the god of the underworld, with his songs. But for all his musical genius, Orpheus was never content. He was deeply in love with his wife, Eurydice, but their love story took a tragic turn when Eurydice died after being bitten by a snake. Her death devastated Orpheus, and in his grief, he decided to do the unthinkable. He would travel to the underworld itself and bring Eurydice back. This is where Orpheus's story begins to lose its shine. You might expect a grand battle, a heroic rescue, or a dramatic confrontation with Hades. But in reality, Orpheus's journey to the underworld was marked by something far more subtle: his music. Instead of fighting monsters or gods, Orpheus simply played his lyre. The music that once charmed animals and mortals now softened the hearts of the gods. Orpheus's music was so beautiful that it moved even the most cold-hearted of deities, including Hades and Persephone, the rulers of the underworld. They were so touched by his song that they allowed him to take Eurydice back to the land of the living on one condition. He could lead her out, but he was forbidden from looking back at her until they reached the surface. It was a simple, clear rule, but one that carried the weight of 1,000 tragedies. Orpheus, in his impatience and fear, began the journey back with Eurydice following behind him. The whole time, he resisted the urge to look back, but the doubt gnawed at him. What if she wasn't really there? What if the gods were tricking him? And so, just as they neared the surface, Orpheus couldn't resist any longer. He turned to look at Eurydice, and in that instant, she was lost to him forever. The gods had promised he could bring her back, but because he disobeyed the rule, Eurydice was pulled back into the underworld. Orpheus's mistake wasn't a grand failure, wasn't some huge battle or catastrophic event. It was a single moment of doubt, a fleeting glance. And that's what makes this myth so deeply human and, well, boring in a way. Orpheus's downfall wasn't caused by some villain or tragic fate, it was a simple lapse of faith. He was given a rule, a chance, and he couldn't follow it. There was no dramatic battle, no divine retribution. There was just a small moment of impatience, and it cost him everything. After losing Eurydice for the second time, Orpheus became a man broken by his own mistakes. He withdrew from the world, refusing to ever love another woman again. His grief consumed him, but instead of leading him to some grand redemption, it simply led to his quiet, unnoticed end. Orpheus was eventually killed by a group of Maenads, followers of Dionysus, who were incensed by his rejection of love and his refusal to honor the gods. They tore him apart, and his head, still singing, was cast into the river. The irony of Orpheus's death is that it wasn't the tragic, heroic end you might expect from someone so deeply connected to the divine. It was messy, brutal, and ordinary in a way. His head, forever singing, drifted along the river, still cherishing the love he had lost. In some versions of the myth, Orpheus's music continued to resonate, even after his death, as a reminder of the lost potential and the fleeting nature of life's chances. Orpheus's story, then, is not just about love or loss, it's about the vulnerability that we all face when it comes to our doubts and decisions. It's a story about how, in a single moment, we can undo everything we've worked for, not through some grand evil or villain, but through simple impatience or a lack of faith. The gods didn't punish Orpheus for his love, but for his inability to trust in what he had been given. He had been warned, and the rule was simple, but in that moment of doubt, he lost everything. Orpheus didn't fight fate or destiny. He simply couldn't wait, couldn't trust. And that's what makes his story so relatable, and in a way, so boring. We all have moments like Orpheus, where our doubts or impatience lead us to make decisions that change the course of our lives. We don't always need a grand catastrophe or a heroic battle to ruin things sometimes. It's just a small mistake that has enormous consequences. In a world where we're constantly rushing, trying to make things happen on our own terms, Orpheus's story is a reminder of the quiet consequences of impatience. It's a tale that resonates, not because it's about grand heroism, but because it's about the little things we fail to do, like trusting the process, like waiting, like believing in the promises made to us. And in that, Orpheus's story is a lesson in patience and trust, even when the gods seem distant. As you settle into the calm of sleep, think of Orpheus and his journey. His story isn't one of glory or violent confrontation. It's the quiet tragedy of a man who couldn't let go of his doubts and, in doing so, lost everything he loved. It's a reminder that sometimes the greatest battles aren't the ones we fight against others, but the ones we fight within ourselves. As we drift deeper into the quiet undercurrents of mythology, let's explore a tale that has been repeated for centuries, but one that's more about patience and acceptance than the dramatic chaos we often associate with Greek heroes. This is the story of Persephone, the goddess of spring, but also the queen of the underworld. You've probably heard of her as the innocent maiden who was kidnapped by Hades, the god of the dead. But let me tell you, Persephone's story isn't as simple as that. It's not just about a girl's capture and a heroic rescue. Oh, no. This story runs far deeper. and it's far less exciting in the way you might expect. Persephone was the daughter of Demeter, the goddess of agriculture, and she lived a life of innocence, surrounded by the beauty of nature. She roamed the fields with nymphs, enjoying the warmth of the sun, the growth of flowers, and the vibrancy of life that seemed to spring from every corner of the earth. But the gods, as they often do, had other plans. One day, as Persephone wandered through a meadow, the earth split open, and from the depths of the underworld, Hades emerged, his chariot drawn by black horses. He didn't come to ask for a dance or offer her a gift. No, he came to claim her as his bride. Persephone, shocked and frightened, had no time to react before Hades abducted her, pulling her into the dark depths of his realm. The gods might have been powerful, but this wasn't a grand battle or a heroic fight. It was simply an unceremonious kidnapping. Persephone, helpless and alone, was taken to the underworld, and her mother, Demeter, was left to mourn the loss of her daughter. Now, here's where things get interesting. Because Persephone's story isn't just about being the innocent victim of an abduction. It's about how she handled what happened next. Demeter, stricken with grief, refused to let anything grow. She withdrew from the world, causing the earth to wither and die. Crops stopped growing, and famine spread across the land. Humanity began to suffer, and even the gods could not ignore the damage. They begged Demeter to restore balance, but she refused until her daughter was returned to her. So, at this point, you might expect a dramatic rescue mission, a group of gods rallying together to save Persephone. Perhaps even a grand battle between the forces of the underworld and Olympus. But no, this story doesn't play out with such high drama. Instead, it's a quiet negotiation between Demeter and Zeus, the king of the gods, who eventually agrees to let Persephone return to the surface, but only under one condition. She had eaten 6 pomegranate seeds during her time in the underworld, and that meant she had to spend part of each year with Hades. The deal was struck, and Persephone would return to the underworld for 6 months of every year. And for the other 6 months, she would be free to roam the earth with her mother. You'd think that after all the drama, there would be some sort of final, heroic resolution, but instead, Persephone's return to the surface was marked by quiet acceptance. She wasn't rescued by an army or a hero. She simply came to terms with her new role as both goddess of spring and queen of the dead. Persephone's tale isn't about a dramatic rescue or an epic conquest. It's about adaptation, acceptance, and finding peace in the most unlikely of circumstances. She was both a symbol of life, with her return bringing the rebirth of spring, and a ruler of death, overseeing the souls in the underworld during the colder months. It's a story about balancing to extremes life and death, light and darkness, learning to coexist with them, even when they seem contradictory. What's fascinating about Persephone's myth is the shift in her character. At first, she is the innocent, carefree maiden, removed from the world of the underworld. But after her abduction, she becomes a figure who rules with Hades, not just as a passive victim, but as a queen with power of her own. Her time in the underworld is marked by quiet growth and transformation. She is no longer the innocent girl who once wandered through the fields. She is someone who has come into her own, learning how to navigate both worlds. And there's something inherently boring about this transformation. It wasn't quick or flashy, it was slow, steady, and full of quiet moments. There were no heroics, battles, no quests for revenge. Persephone's life became one of acceptance, a cyclical journey of growth and retreat. And that's the beauty of her myth. It's about the mundane, the repetitive cycle of seasons, and the way we find meaning in the everyday rhythm of life. While her mother, Demeter, fought for her return, Persephone accepted her fate, recognizing that there was power in both her roles, as the goddess of spring and as the queen of the underworld. Some scholars still argue whether Persephone's dual role symbolizes the contrast between life and death, or if it's a reflection of the inevitability of change. Whatever the case, Persephone's story isn't about overcoming great odds, it's about embracing the cyclical nature of existence. There's a lesson in her journey, one that goes beyond the exciting plots of other myths. Persephone's myth reminds us that life isn't always about grand victories or tragic losses. Sometimes it's about adapting to the circumstances we face and finding balance in the chaos. As you settle into a peaceful slumber tonight, think of Persephone in her two worlds, ruling the dead and bringing life to the earth. Her story may not be full of heroic feats or dramatic battles, but it's one of quiet strength, acceptance, and the beauty found in the flow of life's cycles. Persephone teaches us that, in the end, we don't always need to fight against the world's struggles. Sometimes, the true power lies in accepting and adapting to what comes our way, finding peace in the rhythm of life, even when it means navigating both the light and the darkness. As we near the end of this journey through Greek mythology, let's pause to reflect on the most powerful force of all the fates. Now, you may be thinking, the fates. Surely they have some dramatic role in determining the outcomes of these heroes and villains. But the truth is, their story isn't about sweeping battles or heroic acts. In fact, it's quite boring in a way, especially when compared to the larger-than-life figures we've encountered so far. The Fates were three sisters, Clotho, Lachesis, and Atropos, who controlled the thread of life for every mortal and immortal. Their job wasn't about saving anyone or bringing about great change. It was about maintaining the constant flow of existence without any excitement or flair. Clotho spun the thread of life, Lachesis measured it, and Atropos cut it. When the time was right, they didn't make decisions or judgments. They simply followed the order of the universe, ensuring that every life had a beginning, a middle, and an end. And let's be honest, this isn't exactly the most thrilling job. Imagine a job where all you do is keep everything in its place, without any fanfare, without anyone noticing. You don't get to decide who wins or loses. You don't get to make the exciting calls. You're just there, quietly ensuring the rhythm of life continues as it's supposed to. That's the life of the Fates. But what makes their role interesting, in a strange, mundane way, is that they're the ultimate reminder that nothing in life is truly in our control. The gods may get all the glory for their dramatic interventions. The heroes may get their moment of triumph, but at the end of the day, the Fates are the ones who are responsible for tying everything together. And here's the thing, they don't care who you are. They don't care if you're a king, a queen, a warrior, or a simple mortal. To the Fates, your life is just another thread in the great web of existence, and it will be cut when it's time. No exceptions, no arguments. This story isn't about a grand battle or an epic journey. It's about the quiet, unrelenting passage of time, the fact that every life has a limit, and that limit will come whether you're ready for it or not. What's fascinating about the Fates is that their power wasn't one of intervention. It was one of inevitability. They didn't need to do anything dramatic. They didn't need to make big decisions or bring about grand twists. They just needed to keep things moving forward, ensuring that the world continued on its course. And here's where things get truly boring. At least in the traditional sense of drama-free thread of life, no matter how magnificent or ordinary, was subject to the same fate. You could be a hero like Achilles, destined for glory, or a humble farmer living quietly in the countryside. In the end, the fates would measure your thread, and when your time was up, it would be cut. There was no escaping it, no matter how much you tried. For some, this would be terrifying, an unchangeable future, with no room for alteration. But for others, there's a strange comfort in knowing that everything is already predetermined. You don't need to fight fate or try to control it. It simply is. Some scholars argue whether the fates are a symbol of destiny, fate, or simply the natural order of life. And while they are often seen as a reminder that our lives are fragile and temporary, their story isn't about despair. It's about acceptance. The fates remind us that life doesn't need to be full of heroic deeds to be meaningful. The simple act of existing, of playing our part in the vast web of life, is enough. The fates don't demand anything extraordinary. They don't expect us to be perfect. They simply require us to live, to fulfill our role, and when the time comes, to gracefully allow our thread to be cut. And here's the quiet beauty of the fates' work. It's all about balance. They don't favor anyone over anyone else. Whether you're a king or a beggar, your thread is measured the same way. There is no judgment in their work, just an unwavering commitment to ensuring that every life runs its course. It's almost like the quiet ticking of a clock unnoticed, but constant, inevitable. In many ways, their job is the most boring in the whole mythological pantheon. They don't fight battles or make decisions. They don't weave complex plots or weave elaborate tapestries. They simply measure time, and when it's up, they cut the thread. But isn't there something deeply profound in that simplicity? The idea that life doesn't need to be extraordinary or epic to be meaningful. It's about the journey, the small moments in between, the quiet realization that all we have to do is live without fighting against time. As you close your eyes and let the world fall away, think of the fates, quietly weaving the threads of life. They're not concerned with the drama of battle or the victories of heroes. Their power lies in their quiet, steady presence, ensuring that life continues as it's meant to. There's no grand conclusion, no dramatic flourish, just the steady rhythm of existence, the inevitable end of every thread. And in that, there's a strange peace. Maybe that's what we all need to realize, that it's not the dramatic moments that define us, but the quiet moments, the simple acts of living that are the most important. The fates remind us that life isn't about fighting for control or fame. It's about accepting the rhythm, trusting the process, and understanding that, in the end, we all have a part to play in the grand design.